Good morning, buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. The informal meeting of the Commission for Social Development is called to order. This meeting is held using remote simultaneous interpretation. I kindly ask participants to be mindful of the additional difficulties experienced by interpreters when working remotely and of the increased likelihood of disruptions to the audio feed to the interpreters. Participants may select the preferred language to hear the interpretation or choose the none option to hear the original language of the speaker. Speakers will not be able to unmute their microphones or engage their video until given the floor. If you face audio or video issues during the meeting, please use the Restart All Lines button, which is located above the microphone icon. Should the problem persist, please reload your browser. For technical support, you may also send a private message to the moderator of the platform. I'm particularly thankful to the Secretariat, to Rachel, to Amine, and the entire team. You realized that we started the meeting with a substantive video. It focuses on issues that the Commission for Social Development is dealing with, and all of this has been made possible with the contribution of countries, but primarily with the work, through the work done by the technical department, by Amina in particular, and so thank you once again very much. Today we have a very interesting meeting. I will now invite the Commission to turn to Agenda Item 3C, entitled Social Policy to Promote a More Inclusive, Resilient and Sustainable Recovery, Building Back Better Post-COVID-19 for the achievement of the 2030 Agenda in the context of the Decade of Action and Delivery for Sustainable Development. Dear colleagues, today we are meeting to discuss how the impact of the pandemic has impacted social inequity and poverty levels. It has hard hit the productive economic sector, which was already weakened. In this horrific context, the consequences for the most vulnerable people and sectors are considerable, despite the extraordinary efforts being done by the majority of countries in order to mitigate the social, economic, and health impact. To correct these inequalities is absolutely essential in order to achieve Agenda 2030 and to promote sustainable development without leaving anyone behind. The pandemic has meant that increased efforts are needed by states in a number of social and economic areas, in particular to avoid increasing existing social and economic gaps. And therefore, this space, this forum, gives us an opportunity to see these efforts and to share our national efforts in the socio-economic spheres. When I say sharing, we're doing this in a united fashion, because any state can be used as an example. There can be triangular South-South or North-South cooperation. We have this spirit of solidarity at during these very difficult times. As I said, we are here in this forum to discuss how to generate conditions to create a new normal, which will enable us to build fairer and more egalitarian societies, to safeguard life and to care for people care for the most vulnerable and to give them greater opportunities. That being said, I'm very pleased to welcome the distinguished panelists for our high-level panel discussion. Mr. Jordi Curell Gotor, Director of Labour Mobility at the Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion of the European Commission. Ms. Megumi Muto, Vice President of the Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development at the International Cooperation Agency of Japan. Ms. Cristina Duarte, USG and Special Advisor on Africa to the UN Secretary General. Mr. Jeremy Millard, Senior Consultant at the Danish Technological Institute. Mr. David Smith, Coordinator of the Institute for Sustainable Development and Director of the Center for Environmental Management at the University of the West Indies, Jamaica. And Ms. Victoria Toloso Paz, President of the National Council for the Coordination of Social Policies of Argentina. I would also like to welcome the distinguished lead discussant, Mr. Sang-Yeon Lee, Director of the Employment Policy Department of the International Labour Organization. The moderator for this discussion will be Mr. Pedro Conceição, Director of the Human Development Report Office of the UN Development Programme and lead author of the Human Development Report. Before I hand over the floor to the moderator, I wish to remind panelists to please keep to their allocated time limit of 7 minutes per presentation, and delegations to keep within the 3-minute time limit during the interactive discussion. I will now turn the meeting over to Mr. Conceição to conduct the proceedings of the panel discussion on emerging issues, and I look forward to a productive and interesting exchange of views. Thank you very much, Mr. Conceição. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me thank you for your kind introduction of all our panelists, and let me also join you in welcoming our panelists, our discussant, and all the colleagues that are joining us today. So the agenda item, as you alluded to, Madam Chair, is about emerging issues, and the Commission is invited to consider how to harness social policy to promote a more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 shock. Now, the relevance of social policy for an inclusive recovery is almost self-evident. As we heard from the chair, and as the Secretary General has put it, COVID-19 has been like an X-ray, exposing inequalities and in many cases exacerbating them. And the note prepared by the Secretariat for this session documents this very clearly. Let me just highlight the economic impact on gender inequality. We know that the economic impact has been far worse for women than for men, in part because, as the note highlights, women are overrepresented in many of the economic sectors that have been more affected. But perhaps more worrying, social norms about expectations on the role of women in homework and childcare seem to be reasserting themselves. So many women appear to be pulling back from the labor force. We have documented drops of as much as 10 percentage points in the labor force participation of women, which represent a reversal of progress that has taken decades to achieve. And as more information is becoming available, for instance, on mortality rates across different age groups and different ethnic and racial groups, we now know that reductions in life expectancy, both at birth and at older age, for some historically marginalized groups are 3 to 4 times higher than for others. So I think, as I said, it's almost self-evident that social policy has to take a central role in enabling the recovery to be much more inclusive. But the session also calls upon the importance of social policy if we think about the sustainability of the recovery. And I think this is critical, and I'll just give an example. If we think about fossil fuel subsidies, we know that they impose huge economic costs of as much as $5 trillion a year, according to the IMF. And they encourage overconsumption and overuse of these fossil fuels that are having drastic implications when it comes to climate change. But even with the current context of low energy demand and historically low fuel prices, it's hard sometimes to phase out these fossil fuel subsidies, less because of the economic aspects, but because they need to come along with very strong social policies that cushion the impact on low and middle income populations. Otherwise, it's difficult to mobilize the public and political support, as we've seen again and again. So let me just conclude by saying that social policy is central to build forward better, and that while our attention must be on those most vulnerable, I think it's crucial also to not lose sight of the importance of these social policies to lay out the foundations for either more or less equitable societies going forward. And we have seen many examples in history where the actions that we take through social policies can have legacies that last for decades and sometimes even centuries. So with this brief introduction, I want to turn to our panelists. Again, as the chair emphasized, I want to make a plea to please stay within the 7 minutes during your initial presentation so that we don't take time away from one another. And more importantly, from the dialogue that we would like to encourage after the presentations and the discussion by Sang-Yeon Lee. So first, I want to invite Jordi Corell-Gotor, who is the Director of Labor Mobility in the Director General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion at the European Commission, to make his presentation. Jordi, over to you. We're waiting for Jordi. Please bear with us.
I think that now it's
Jordi,
working now, okay?
Yes, over to you. Thank you.
Apologies for the problem of connection. Thanks to Madam Chair, thanks to you for organizing and then for moderating this event. I think that you have set the scene pretty clearly. What we see is that this pandemic affects everybody, and this COVID-19 crisis is more than just one crisis. I mean, this pandemic has had a devastating impact across the globe everywhere, and it has had impacts in health, in social, and in the economic areas. No? And the world in general, and in particular, the world of work has changed massively because of this pandemic. Or to be more precise, I think that many of the changes, many of the tendencies which were underlying those changes have been brought to the fore with much more emphasis. And we are facing now issues that we knew we had to address, but that now they have become even more urgent. And this also, of course, is the case everywhere, but also in Europe. And the social impact of this crisis has been enormous. And we have 40 million workers which have applied to short-term schemes, and they do fear, and rightly so, for their jobs. And many others have lost their jobs. And what we see, and you mentioned that before, is that indeed the impact of the crisis are uneven. And I think that ILO, and I'm sure that Shangun will tell us something about that later on, has shown that there are specific vulnerable categories which have suffered more than others. The first one that comes to mind, of course, is young people. They are affected for it. Many of them had difficult jobs in sectors which have been hard hit, tourism, retail, food, building, and many others who are about to engage in this transition from education to work. Now, of course, they have many difficulties. With Madam Chair, I had the occasion to participate last week at the event with the UN youth delegates, and it was very clear, at least they took two very clear messages. First of all, is that youth is very dynamic and they are very committed to working in order to make a better world. But for that, and I think that rightly so, they ask us, less young people, to involve them in the decision making. And I think they are very right. And I think that initiatives like the UN Youth Delegate Forum is a very useful one. The crisis, and you said it, has also a gender dimension. We can see that, again, women are often in more vulnerable sectors. And beyond that, there's been a very clear increase in unpaid care work at home. And that, of course, has, and unhappily, has hit harder women than men. And therefore, inequalities are growing in this respect as well. Same thing if we look at the situation of the homelessness. I know that this commission paid specific attention to these homeless people last year, and of course the situation has worsened for them. And with the crisis, we can unhappily see it. All of us can see it in our cities. Of course, the list of vulnerable people is pretty long, so I will stop it here. But I think that the main point is that when we build back, we have to build back better. And when we say that we need to build back better, it means that we need to take into account this social dimension. It's not just economy for the sake of it. It has to be economy, but also at the service of the people. And we need to make sure that inequalities decrease. And I think that this echoes very much with what the UN Secretary General highlighted in his report in March last year. He says, and we do agree, at least from the European Union, we do agree with him very much, that the economic recovery goes hand in hand with social justice and decent work. And again, he added, and I think that this is a fundamental thing, and that's why I believe that the work of this commission, and in particular the subject that we are discussing now, is a fundamental one, is that we need to, when we get over the crisis, we need to have put the foundations, have laid the foundation for a better society. And all the problems, undeclared work, lack of social protection, non-decent work, etc., we need to lay the foundations for this to be addressed from the beginning in our response to the crisis. And this is across the whole spectrum. I mean, if we talk about working conditions, we can think about these new forms of work which are less protected. We can talk about occupational safety and health. If we talk about social protection, we can talk about the need to cater for non-standard professional lives and to be able to protect everybody from all these risks. I see some room for hope, if I may put it in that manner. If I compare in Europe, but not only in Europe, the response that the public authorities have given to the crisis and compare it with the response to the previous one, I see a major difference. And what I see in the response to this crisis, and as I said, it's not just in Europe, it goes beyond, is that there has been a massive investment in order to try to reduce the immediate impact of the crisis. And we have, at EU level, we have come up with an agreement for what we call the Next Generation EU, which provides for massive investments at EU level in order to make sure that the most acute impacts of the crisis are rendered less cruel, I would say. I guess that our real challenge now is to make sure that in the post-crisis, we don't stop this change of attitude too early, because otherwise that would be a problem. So again, we believe that this commission, the Commission for Social Development, is an excellent forum to share experiences, and I'm more than happy to be here with you and to be able to listen to the other panelists and, of course, to the audience when they come with the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordi. You alluded to the impact on young people, and I just want to underline a recent finding from the literature that suggests that young people, if they enter the labor market during a recession, the impact is felt throughout their lives. So it's not only a temporary thing that they will be able to bounce off from and recover, but it's something that is felt over their entire lifetimes. And in fact, this argument is one that is weighing very heavily as countries are looking at the fiscal response, and the size of the fiscal response is to ensure that, especially for new entrants in the labor market, they are not scared for life. With that, let me invite Megami Mutu, Vice President of JICA. Nice to see you again virtually. I guess it's a bit late in Tokyo, again, because we were together this past Friday in the Tokyo launch of the Human Development Report. So
yes,
good to see you again, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias, distinguished members of the Commission, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor to speak in this very important session. We find ourselves in a dilemma, or trilemma, I would say. We have to protect lives and health, we have to keep the economy going, but we have to keep also the freedom of individuals. Japan's case might not be the best example in going through this pandemic, but we are somewhat managing partly due to risk reduction. This is a topic that I will talk about. One is the reduction of exposure by wearing masks, social distancing, and washing hands. Another aspect is investing in universal healthcare, lifelines, and other social services so that people could be resilient. Third, but not least, a general trust on risk communication and how to change behavior during times of emergency has been an asset. I will try to look at the pandemic from the lens of disaster risk reduction, the central concept of the Sendai framework. Japan has a history of mega-sized natural calamities. Each time we have learned hard lessons. With overwhelming hazard, exposure, and vulnerabilities, it is just impossible to manage during disasters. It is imperative to reduce the risk ex ante. Thus, the Sendai framework is disaster risk reduction. Of course, we cannot reduce all the risks ex ante. For the residual, yet still large risk, we have to prepare for it, take emergency actions when hit, and build back better. Incorporating ex ante measures, systems, and capacities for the next hazard. With this lens, then how can we interpret the current pandemic? Risk is the confluence of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. In the current pandemic, the hazard is COVID-19. Exposure is the behavioral pattern of people linked with probability of infection. Working on vulnerability means protecting and empowering people so that they can face the next hazard with higher degree of preparedness to avoid detrimental effects to human security. As an immediate response to COVID-19, societies worked on reducing the exposure. At JICA, my institution, we supported water utilities and together promoted hand washing, for example. Urban transport project teams supported counterparts in reducing the exposure in mass transit. But the most critical juncture in connecting the Sendai framework to the pandemic is how to work on social protection and empowerment to reduce the vulnerability. At JICA, we are working on several fronts. One is supporting response measures and building resilient social protection through the budgetary system. For example, the Philippines was very fast in inviting ADB and us to provide COVID-19 Crisis Response Emergency Support Loan. Through this budgetary support, immediate responses in the health sector, cash transfer to the poor, wage subsidies for SMEs, and non-interest agriculture credits were made possible. India is a real pioneer in overhauling the social protection system in response to COVID-19, integrating five social protection programs into one PMGKY system. The system includes targeted multiple protection to the vulnerable, including healthcare, cash transfer, food, and energy support, and even protection when working across states. We joined in the co-financing for this program led by the World Bank. The second area is supporting resilient health systems with focus on key institutions. Our approach to health sector evolves around building long-term capacities at key institutions, such as laboratories and hospitals. That has emerged in the past of some leading institutions, such as the Noguchi Memorial Institute for Medical Research in Ghana or Kenya Medical Research Institute. They led the PCR testing in each country. Both institutes have also provided training opportunities for neighboring countries in cooperation with JICA. We also have a long history of cooperation to build capacities on key hospitals. For example, in Vietnam, JICA has supported Vietnamese government to strengthen their 3 highest level hospitals. Each of these hospitals provided training to the staff of lower level hospitals. So we are creating a system in which the capacity of the hospitals are elevated. Building on these experiences, we are preparing projects and programs to strengthen key hospitals in other countries. We have also remotely connected doctors and health practitioners around the world to share lessons and practices. The third area that I would like to mention is extra protection efforts in other sectors, such as in education. In Burkina Faso, we are supporting the education reform program to improve the access and quality with gender emphasis. There are extra efforts to improve nutrition this time, including school meals combined with COVID-19 awareness campaign. And last potential area is rethinking resilience governance from the Sendai framework lens. At the outset, I mentioned that Japan is managing somewhat through the waves, but there are many lessons, especially in terms of the coordination between central and local governments. Recently, we had a session with political scientists to learn about bottlenecks in emergency governance in Japan. It is not the case of dichotomy of bottom-up versus central command. Devils are in the details of the governance design. One example is that because of decentralization of basic health services to the cities level, closer to the communities, central governments faced practical difficulties in immediately expanding capacities at the front lines and flexibility across cities. There is room to rethink about resilience governance at times of major unexpected risks. So in summary, social protection in response to COVID-19 should have elements of rebuilding systems and capabilities to be ready for the next pandemic. Building back better is not just greener, but very deeply social and even an opportunity to rethink governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me emphasize the relevance of the lens that you brought to the debate of looking at the crisis from a disaster risk reduction perspective. Because in fact, this is a very different crisis if you look at the economics of it from a typical recession in which you want to stimulate the economy or increase demand. But here we are asking actually people to reduce economic activity. And so what people need is much closer to what we usually think in terms of disaster assistance, to help people to cope with the shock and be, as you said, better prepared to become resilient in the future. So thank you. Let me now invite Cristina Duarte, Under Secretary General and Special Advisor on Africa to the United Nations Secretary General, to make a presentation. Over to you.
Good morning, Pedro.
Morning. Bom dia.
Bom dia, Pedro. Good morning, Madam Chair, and to all participants. Thank you for the opportunity, and protocol observed, allow me to start my remarks. In my opinion, there is a need to change the policy-making mindset from backward-designed social policies to forward-looking human capital policies, so that we can move from assistance charity approach to a clear recognition that human capital policies should be designed to generate social, economic, and cultural returns. Of course, this requires a new conceptual approach associated to a new narrative, so that we can support, from a UN system standpoint, policymaking and partners moving away from example, cash transfer policies to food for assets policies. And COVID-19 has created the necessary disruptions to do so. COVID-19 has created the opportunity to place human capital at the center of policymaking in Africa. And the driver of this reconceptualization in the policymaking field is to recognize human capital investments as sources of social resilience and sustainable economic growth. We all agree that the gains in the past, let's say 20, 25 years are significant. 55% fewer children dying before age 5, 50% fewer children are out of school, 40% fewer mothers die from childbirth, and life expectancy is up by over 6 years in Africa. But despite these gains, we should recognize that it is essentially an unfinished business. And the major challenges remain. Nearly a quarter of all young children are stunted and at high risk for physical and cognitive deficits. In many countries, approximately half of children who attend school do not reach minimum level of competency in math and reading. Only 50% of children between 3 and 6 years attend some form of early childhood education. And over 300,000 children die early from diarrhea. What I have been noticed, and I have been in the policymaking field in the past 25 years, this reality tends to cause sometimes a charity reaction from policymakers. But no, this is essentially loss of social, economic, and cultural values. And this is exactly what the World Bank Service Survey, World Bank Service Delivery Survey tell us regarding the health and primary education service delivery experience over 450 million people in Africa. Fewer than 20% of teachers master the curriculum they teach. Health providers, on average, students are taught only 2 hours and 46 minutes. Health providers misdiagnose on average 50% of basic conditions. These figures entail a huge opportunity cost. And in moving from traditional backward social policies to forward-looking human capital policies, the massive adoption of technological innovation is a must. But as we know today, around 50% of world's children will be trapped in low productivity. 50% of world's children will be trapped in low productivity. Again, Human Capital World Bank Index shows that nearly 60% of children born today will at best be half as productive as they could be if they had completed education and full health. So countries still face a massive unfinished human development agenda. And of course, this has strong implications for productivity, inclusive economic growth, and also our collective ability to end extreme productivity. So I do believe that policymakers in general need to recognize that there is a global human capital crisis that clearly calls for reconceptualization or for reconceptualizing social policies. And I would like to end to raise 4 critical issues in this reconceptualization of social policies, so moving from backward social policies to a more forward-looking human capital policies. The first one, financing. It is particularly clear a challenge in countries with low capacity to generate revenue, weak allocation of budgets, and inefficient spending. Second, value for money. Moving from backward social policies to forward-looking human capital policies, the question, I believe, the question of value for money surfaces and pressures for a much better quality of public spending on human capital sectors. The third issue that I would like to raise, governance and accountability, are an important, an unavoidable ingredient in redesigning this new generation of social policies. The fourth, income distribution. Policy making is a value chain. So to address human capital crisis, we need to act upstream and downstream. Upstream by increasing human capital investments, something quite obvious. Downstream by adopting income distribution policies to guarantee that the value unleashed by human capital investments is appropriate by all levels of civil society. So well distributed. Basically, the need to reinstate the social contract globally. And the income distribution in the policy-making value chain, in my view, is the critical issue, at least to avoid what happened in the last 60 years. The labor productivity increased by 240%, but the average salaries only by 0.5%. So a clear example how the social contract has been broken. And I do believe to address this, we need to redesign, to reconceptualize social policies. Thank you, Pedro. Back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cristina. Wonderful invitation for us to look at social policy, not as assistance, but really as an investment. And that takes us also to the importance of assets, which you emphasized, including human capital as a critical asset. In fact, that's why in the Human Development Index, we have not only an indicator of income, but also have indicators related to achievements in health and education. And you're also right that Human Capital Index of our colleagues of the World Bank enables us to quantify the losses in productivity, strengthening even further this case for investment. Thank you again. Let me now invite Jeremy Millard, who is a senior consultant at the Danish Technological Institute and a visiting research fellow at several universities. Jeremy, over to you.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me okay?
Very well, thank you.
Good, all the way from Denmark, right? So it's going to be getting dark here soon. I'd like to stream a short presentation. Let me see if it works okay. Otherwise, I'll just talk. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I want to talk about what I call the new localism, and I'm sure most of you have heard these sorts of discussions before. But I think what's happening with the COVID-19, there's a renewed acceleration of decentralization and interconnectivity. These things were happening before, but they're becoming much more prevalent, I think, now. And the question will be whether it will continue afterwards, of course. But I work a lot on the ground at the coalface with real concrete solutions with governments and SMEs and NGOs. And I want to look at 4 concrete policy actions, which I've listed there. I'll try to keep within my 7 minutes, but I won't read all my slides verbatim, of course. The first one I want to look at is this move to circular cities, which is part of the circular economy approach, of course. Cities are the sweet spot between they have both power and resources to do real things on the ground, but they're also very close to their inhabitants, of course. And of course, cities have been losing some of their attraction during COVID, but I think that's going to come back with a great force once COVID is more under control. But I'm looking much more now at how city circular systems and jobs are going to be much more important in the future than they are at the moment. Just a couple of two quick examples. In Helsinki, the restaurants are starting to compost the local food waste. And this is being looped back to local farmers. They're growing ingredients on the premises, and this is increasing local jobs. This is a much more shorter value chains than we've seen before. This is still quite small scale, of course, but it's happening at a dramatic pace. Looking at Haiti, you've got the local decentralized energy systems, these microgrids, where people are developing electricity from solar mainly here, but also wind, and also sharing it locally. And this is employing about 90% of local staff. If we look at some of the bigger cities, you've heard of Kate Raworth's donut economy approach. A lot of things are happening here around the world. Amsterdam is a good example, focusing very much on regeneration and inclusion, respecting both social foundations and planetary limits. In Amsterdam itself, they're looking at 3 types of value chains: food and organic waste, a bit similar to Helsinki; consumer goods, where it's a question of reuse, repair, recycling, a lot more than is happening before with furniture and with clothing, etc. With the built environment, it's much more in relation to using building materials, again, recycling those locally, and building climate-friendly buildings and infrastructures, and monitoring them with sensors. And this is happening also in Copenhagen, Medellin, Philadelphia, other places as well. Looking at local complementary currencies, which are actually have been around for many, many years, used to be called local economic trading systems, LETS, but it's basically about money that is re-spent locally is the same as attracting new money into that area. What we often see in many local economies at the moment is that big multinationals take over the local high street, and they make the money and they send it away, maybe to a tax haven, something like that. But the idea of a local currency is it's only used locally. And there are lots of good examples of this. Of course, the Bristol pound in the UK is one of the earliest, which is quite very, very popular and being used quite a lot. The results show that it's not so much in terms of monetary benefits, but certainly a lot more involvement amongst citizens and local businesses in city governments, and developing local economic policies. If we look at another example, for example, in Kenya, there are clear economic benefits, direct ones. For example, the Safaru credit in Kenya, which is actually increasing the business income about 22%, and is used for 10% of local food purchases. But there's not just economic benefits, there's also benefits in terms of a trust in local institutions and local businesses. Looking at basic income schemes, these are basically unconditional cash transfers that were mentioned before, or another similar thing is negative income tax. Universal basic income has been discussed a lot. There's got pros and cons, of course, but all the trials show that UBI doesn't make people lazy or decrease labour participation or increase unemployment, which is often feared. But it often has a large number of different types of positive effects on well-being, self-confidence, skills, also on social enterprise, and even positive effects on employment as well. A good example, which is actually slightly conditional, is the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, which has been going for about 30 years now, providing about $34 per month to low-income families, so it's targeted, and it contributes quite a lot to reducing poverty, improving school attendance, and reducing child labour. Another example, which is perhaps one of the earliest, Dauphine in Canada, a very small town north of Winnipeg, which only lasted about 4 years, and it was only stopped by austerity policies in the country. But actually, recent research has shown that it kept everybody out of poverty, decreased hospitalization and mental illness, and hugely increased cultural life, which was very interesting. No one quit their job, but the only ones who worked a little less were mothers and students who stayed longer in school. So a lot of research has been done on these sorts of things. And the benefits are mainly, of course, things like health and greater confidence, greater trust and inclusion locally. I want to move on now to employee-owned enterprises, which has been actually strongly promoted by the United Nations. Ban Ki-moon was somebody who looked at this quite a lot in the past. These have a lot of variety of different names: worker cooperatives, mutuals, employee-owned businesses. The basic raison d'etre for them is they are owned by the members or their employees who share the profits, democratically controlled, and there's a small gap between pay levels. For example, in some cases, it's no more than six-fold difference. And they have a wider social purpose. So they're like social enterprises in many ways. These are now starting to take off in Africa to some extent. Cyril Ramaphosa started to bring this into his policy in 2019, just before COVID struck, of course. But there are also SMEs who are using this. Phoenix International in Uganda, for example, has an employee ownership program where the employees receive what they call Phoenix Flames or shares according to their seniority. And this has been very successful. And most of these are very small and have only local impacts, which is really the theme of what I'm talking about. But there are quite a few large ones. I mean, most famous is Mondragon in Spain, which has over 70,000 employees. During the crisis of financial crisis 2007 and 8, they actually didn't lose any staff, and they only cut their salaries by 5%, whilst most Spanish companies lost about 3.5 million workers in total. So a lot of research again has been done on this, and again there are pros and cons. But in the US, for example, employee ownership has shown to narrow the gender and racial wealth gaps, gives actually employees significantly more wealth and share in the profits. And they generally perform much better. The big issue here is they are resisted by banks, lawyers, and governments. Now, the interesting discussion, which I won't go into here, is why that is so when they're so successful on the whole.
Jeremy, can I ask you to come close to the conclusion, please?
Yeah, this is the conclusion now, okay?
Thank you.
My key lessons are that in the aftermath of COVID-19, we're seeing a more deglobalized and decentralized world with shorter value chains, more in and onshoring, and more local and regional markets. And I'll just look at the first one here. The four examples I've shown about the new localism and work have to be carefully contextualized. They're not panaceas, and they're not solutions to every post-COVID-19 issue, but they do need to be massively expanded and rolled out. As I've tried to mention, they all have pros and cons, I think, but they are really policy sort of strategies which can be adopted, and they need to be rolled out a lot more than they have been. And they're particularly relevant, I think, at the moment when we're starting to come out, hopefully, from COVID-19. So I hope that this has given some food for thought. I'm sure most people have heard about these things before, but we have to be a lot more systematic, I think, in implementing some of these issues. So I'll close on that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. So indeed, you were able to flesh out very clearly the intersections between social policies and sustainability. They are actually very closely interrelated. And there is some evidence actually suggesting that during COVID-19, there is a renewed interest in sustainability. So UNDP put out a survey, the largest ever survey on concerns over climate change that was conducted last year. And when we would expect that people would lose interest, perhaps, in climate change or environmental issues, but actually, the concern of 2/3 of the people inquired was there. And we've also seen from searches in Google that has been an increase in searches over terms like reusing and recycling. So this is not scientific data or survey data, but I think it's revealing of a very interesting moment in which people are understanding the connection between the COVID-19 crisis, sustainability, and social policies.
Yeah, the so-called sharing economy, I think, is very important in this. Yeah, okay.
Indeed. Thank you, Jeremy. Let me now turn to David Smith, coordinator of the Institute for Sustainable Development and director of the Center for Environmental Management at the University of West Indies. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pedro, and greetings to everybody, regardless of which time zone you are in. I would like to talk a little bit about emerging issues and particularly digital technology. I start out firstly by reminding everybody that WHO is looking at many different pandemics right now. The one that we are most concerned about, obviously, is one of many. And what we learn in this pandemic and what we do to help ourselves in this pandemic should be done in such a way to help ourselves for the next pandemic that may come along. This graph shows the deaths due to COVID in countries in the Caribbean, in the Greater Antilles, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Haiti, and Cuba. This shows accumulated deaths per million of population, comparing the same countries to the United Kingdom, the United States, and Mexico. The questions we have to ask is inequality a factor in this? And what is the role of international travel? Because deaths are not related to the size of the population of the country. They may be negatively related to GDP per capita. Some of the richer countries have much higher levels of infection, deaths, and cases. And government intervention and people's actions and travel seem to be extremely important. In terms of how we might move forward to sustainability in this context, I want to point out that the World in 2050 and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network both point to the need for use of the digital revolution or digital technology as something which will be able to help us. And the Global Sustainable Development Report of 2019 mentions science and technology as one of the 4 levers that would be applied to entry points to allow us to transform our societies and get to the Sustainable Development Goals. It is therefore important to bear this in mind that we should build human capital. A previous speaker has emphasized this as well. But education improves people's resilience to disasters. Even if you take out their income differences, they're still better at dealing with disaster the better they are educated. It increases human capital, increasing education and skills improves resilience, and tertiary education is vital if we are going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. If we are then going to reduce risk in terms of moving forward in a post-COVID society or within COVID, we need to, I believe, improve accessibility to the internet, to build education and to improve human capital, that we should expand our phone and internet coverage and improve home access through low-cost machines and free and open source software. The problem with that is, of course, that internet access is highly unequal, not only between countries, but within countries. So even for countries that are, some of these are small island developing states, some of these are countries that are less developed, there is a vast difference in the increase the amount of people who can access the internet. Also, with the percentage of people who may own cell phones. Usually, for most countries, more people have cell phones than people who have access to the internet, but there is still a vast inequality. Also, the strategies we pursue should take into account that there are differences in deaths per capita that are quite profound throughout the world, and that there are differences in internet access, and the way that they work together means that we will have to look at different strategies for different kinds of countries. So, for example, we have countries which have relatively low deaths and low access to internet. We have countries which have relatively low deaths and good access to the internet, and a lot of countries which have high access to the internet, but also high numbers of deaths from COVID. The roles that the internet may be able to play would be to help to reduce the need for movement, which is going to be extremely important in reducing transmission of COVID. Facilitating commerce, facilitating education, and facilitating money transfers and things like parametric crop insurance and the use of innovative financial instruments which might use blockchain. So I leave you with some ideas. I think we need to provide free basic internet access for everybody and treat internet access in the same way that we treat access to water supply. If you need more than basic internet access, then you can pay for that service. Bear in mind that phones work very well for business, but not for education. We need to re-emphasize open data, open access, open source, free and open source software for use in education, and open hardware. If the battery on the laptop for the child or the cell phone or the tablet for the child is not replaceable, it is not sustainable. We need to make sure that our children and our students are provided or have access to computers with keyboards, even if they can get to school. It's not a substitute for being able to go to school. But bear in mind that tablets are not as good as computers. Students need to be able to create content and send that back. That's how they learn. We should also not neglect physical books and paper, even in this marvelous internet age. We probably should try and find ways of cooperating among countries to create audiovisual material for education and find ways to increase teacher training for mixed delivery and online. It is unlikely that all our students throughout the world will be able to get access simply through internet. There are some places where they will be able to go to school, but in those places where they can't, we should try to bear all these things in mind, because the benefits of building human capital will definitely last for a long time and probably last to the next pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Let me just refer to some calculations that we did last year to try to estimate the impact of COVID-19 on education. And the angle we took was precisely asymmetries, inequalities in access to the internet. And according to our estimates, last year, as many as 9 out of every 10 children in low human development countries were effectively unable to participate in formal education because they didn't have access to the internet. So on average, if you take what we call the effective out-of-school rate, it would take us to school enrollment rates after accounting for access to the internet that we haven't seen since the mid-1980s. So just to emphasize the importance of access to digital technologies, David. So we'll move to the last panelist. So it's my pleasure to invite Victoria Tolosa Paz, who is the president of the National Council for the Coordination of Social Policies in Argentina, to make her presentation. Over to you. I hope Victoria is with us. Oh, sorry. Apparently, Vittoria is not with us. So let me move on to my very good colleague, a good friend, Sang-Yeon Lee, to provide his perspectives. Just to remind you, Sang-Yeon, that as a discussant, we would invite you to use 5 minutes for your initial intervention.
Thank you so much. Do you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pedro, and thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity. As the many panelists has already pointed out, the COVID-19 pandemic led to the dramatic loss of the human lives worldwide, and also present an unprecedented challenges to public health and the well-being. And at the same time, it has a huge impact on the workers and enterprises as well. And actually, the impact has been quite devastating. Our estimate basically shows that the last year pandemic brought the working hours down by 8.8%, which is about 255 million full-time jobs. So already at this point, in our estimation, the scale of this loss is 4 times greater than during the global financial crisis in 2009, and the crisis is not over yet. And the working hours are expected to stay well below the pre-pandemic level for quite an extended period of time. As a result of this, the impacts, many people, as you can imagine, the unemployed and drop out of the labor market completely. It is one of the very important characteristics of this crisis that the people tends to move more into the inactivities rather than unemployment, which again causes additional challenges. As we know, people once outside of the labor market are facing more difficulties than unemployed people to actually find decent job during the recovery. So income also actually decreased dramatically. We estimate about 8.3%, which is about the 3.7 trillion US dollars or the 4.4% of GDP. So with these losses, and we are basically at the risk of losing the gains we made over the last decade in terms of poverty reduction and other progress made towards reaching the SDGs. And it's also important to remember this job crisis is genuinely global, so it affects all countries, but at the same time very, very uneven, as there are large variations between countries. For example, lower middle income countries were hit particularly hard. But even the country with a sufficient fiscal space to soften the impact of the crisis are still struggling to do so because the crisis lasted longer than expected. But again, we know the fiscal packages are right now the only way to soften the impact, and at the same time getting economies on the recovery track as quickly as possible. So at the moment, because of all this uneven impact or uneven capacities to mitigate them, we are a bit worried about the possible risk that this crisis will widen inequality between countries further. In addition, the pandemic does not affect all workers and business to the same extent. And young and women and migrant, low paid and low skilled and informal workers, for instance, have been taking a disproportionate share of the pains. And often precarious low paid jobs, including those in the platform economy, they did not benefit from the social the protection measures. While importantly, high paid jobs, for instance, in finance and technology, remained largely intact. So we shouldn't forget all this actually, the impact actually are basically taking place when actually demographic and climate changes, the technological changes and globalization, all of these are changing happening. So at this point, I just cannot refrain myself actually from stressing the negative impact of the crisis on young people. The crisis made the already difficult transition into the labor market often impossible. In addition, education and career paths are interrupted and dreams and aspirations are destroyed, often forever. So we are at the risk of losing this generation. the generation that we need so much right now to build the better future we all want. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored also the pivotal social and economic role of social protection system, as echoed by many panelists before. Well-designed social protection systems are preconditions for flexibility by ensuring that workers can securely move from one job to another, even if it involves the phase of the unemployment inactivities. But at the same time, the 4 billion people worldwide are not actually protected by social protection system at all, and many more are only partially protected. This large protection gap has been painfully exposed during the crisis, leaving the workers, especially in temporary and part-time work and self-employed, and also those in informal economy, without sufficient means to get through the crisis. Of course, government's done lots of things to fill this gap, but there are more certain to be done. Now it is time for governments, together with social partners, to mend this gap in their social protection system and to ensure all workers are adequately covered and irrespective of types of employment. This is really, really critical preconditions for countries to better prepare for future challenges in the changing world of work that can at any point be hit by a crisis. So there is no alternative to supporting a recovery that is robust and broad-based, and focusing on employment and income and workers' rights and social dialogue. Altogether, we are talking about inclusive, at the same time, human-centered recovery. For that, we need to maintain an accommodative, I must say even the proactive macroeconomic policy environment to support income and investment, aiming for unprecedented level of the international solidarity. We need to assist low and middle income countries with vaccination and policy measures. Inclusive recovery also requires pursuing a policy course that gets people, especially most vulnerable, into decent job, and that continuously protects those who need protection. In the midterm, we also need to help enterprise workers in different sectors to profit actually from the structural transformation process, which will lead us towards a more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable world of work. All of these changes in the world of work needs to be accompanied by strong social protection system again and effective labor protection, so that the flexibility does not translate into insecurity for workers and their families. Thank you, Pedro. Over to you.
Thank you. And Inu, let me also thank all the wonderful work that they are doing throughout the crisis, showcasing the depth of the impact and also providing some very important guidance for policymakers. So this brings us to the end of the panelists. We will hear from Victoria as soon as she's able to join us. We very much would like to hear from her. But in the meantime, I'm happy to invite delegates or any colleagues to ask questions to the panelists or to make comments. And I see that we already have some colleagues that want to speak. So let me invite Shifa Abbas to address all of us, and then that intervention will be followed by Alejandro Gonzalez from the Cuba delegation, followed by Rosemary Edilon from the Philippines delegation. So first, Shifa Abbas.
Hello, thank you so much. My name is Shifa Abbas. I'm from Imamia Medics International, an NGO serving humanity through health and education and humanitarian relief all over the world. Post-COVID-19, we recognize the necessity of digital technologies in accessing work, education, support services, and its role in the provision of healthcare. Equitable healthcare necessitates digital equity and the ability to access healthcare services like telemedicine for the most remote and vulnerable populations. As NGOs, I would like to ask the speakers, what are the most important, as Ms. Cristina Duarte mentioned, forward-looking social policies we should advocate for at the national levels to ensure equitable access to these digital technologies for our beneficiaries by 2030?
Thank you so much. Also, thank you for the brevity. I will remind all of us that we should not exceed 3 minutes as you make your comment or ask your question. So over to Alejandro Gonzalez. Alejandro? If Alejandro is not able, maybe I can invite in the meantime Rosemary Edilon. Rosemary, over to you.
Yes. Yes, hello. So I just would like to share with you, some issues that we have seen with respect to social policy, especially at this time of the pandemic. First of all, we would like to say that we have seen how social policy can significantly reduce poverty and even promote economic growth, as we have seen here in the Philippines. But some new issues have come about. One, there really is a need to develop innovative mechanisms to deliver social services amid the health crisis. So, for instance, for a very long time, we have been delivering healthcare, education, and nutrition services using a face to face, facility based modality. This will need to change. Two, we need to improve the substantive part of social services using technology. So in education, for instance, the content will need to incorporate more technology know-how in order to encourage students to be creative and innovative, which is what they will need in order to better cope with ever-changing circumstances. Three, the pandemic has resulted in a massive loss of jobs and incomes. We know this. So since we are seeing actually a higher demand for publicly provided social services. So while government needs to meet this demand, the livelihood of private providers should also be protected. A new form of public-private partnership should then be integrated in the formulation of social policy. Four, the pandemic has given rise to more difficulties for the already vulnerable. Early on, we have resolved to protect our most vulnerable, the elderly, the persons with disabilities, those with comorbidities, young children, from the risk of COVID-19 infection. And we did this by restricting their mobility. Of course, we provided them with food. But they had other needs, as it turns out. And in 40% of families with vulnerable individuals, there was no one else who could run errands to secure their other needs. So such information should actually be included in our database for a more effective implementation of social protection programs. Finally, this pandemic also challenged the way we monitor social outcome indicators. Once again, we need to come up with innovative monitoring schemes, say of health and nutrition outcomes, without risking disease exposure. Note that especially during this time of a health crisis, we really need to have access to accurate and timely information about the health status of our constituency. We have started in the Philippines introducing some changes in the way we implement social policy, though much more remain to be done. And I'm actually eager to find out how other countries have been working on these issues, because we know that we need to act fast. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me turn back to the distinguished representative of Cuba to see if he's able to make his comment or ask his question. If not, let me go to the distinguished representative of Argentina, to be followed by the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
COVID-19, the government of Argentina has taken a series of measures in order to ensure citizens' rights, in particular the right to life, health, and physical integrity. According to a report published by UN Women with the UN Development Program, Argentina was at the top of the ranking of countries establishing public policies in light of the pandemic. The state has implemented a number of measures, and I would mention the following. A national action plan against gender-based violence through 22 to promote better accessibility. In order to strengthen this area, we've worked on issues involving diversity, and this is not just for women, but also we've dealt with domestic violence across the board. We also have a number of apps that they can access. In terms of gender and diversity, we have a new decree and a new program that has been set up. We provide direct assistance to individuals who are at risk of gender-based violence. And we provide them minimum wages for a 6-month period and provide them psychosocial assistance through our women's ministry, and we work also with local institutions. I would invite the panelists to reflect on the importance of gender-based measures as we face the pandemic and to share experiences in combating gender-based violence during the pandemic. Thank you.
Let me try the distinguished representative of Cuba. If not, let me go to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic, to be followed by the distinguished representative of Japan. Dominican Republic. Let me try then to move straight to distinguished representative of Japan, if that is possible.
Personas con discapacidad, juventud, entre otros grupos. Por esto hace necesario que los estados implementen.
Consequently, it's necessary for states to implement public policies which are grounded in law. For this reason, the DR has aimed to increase universal access to education and healthcare. We had a national day designed to increase sign-up of Dominican Republican people to healthcare coverage. Regarding older persons, they've been affected in terms of their increased vulnerability to contagion. They're more vulnerable to the pandemic in general, and that has had an impact on their ability to earn because they can't go out to work. To improve this situation, we have the program Families of Affection, and that aims to give priority care to elder women, providing them with revenue opportunities, and we've also got revenue opportunities or revenue supplementation opportunities for women heads and households. Now we're looking to harness traditional knowledge and use that to improve our pandemic response, and we're also looking to increase the digital skills of older persons so they can better enter the labour market, but also we're looking to ensure that they can make best use of the knowledge that they already have. Digital technology has a crucial role to play in ensuring that older persons can continue to earn during the pandemic. So we're looking to reduce the digital gap by implementing the info literacy program, And this program looks to train older persons in the use of digital tools. By way of conclusion, I would state that we staunchly believe that in order to achieve more inclusive and resilient recovery from the pandemic, and in order to fully achieve Agenda 2030 on sustainable development, states must rally in order to tackle problems that societies are facing. International cooperation is key in matters of social development. My government is fighting to promote the development of a society which includes all ages. Thank you.
To the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic, and we now move to the distinguished representative of Japan, to be followed by Sue Wilson. Japan now. Let me give you another couple of seconds to see if the connection works. Let me try Sue Wilson. Sue?
Okay, thank you. I'm Sue Wilson, representing the congregations of St. Joseph. If we're going to create a better normal out of the pandemic, we must not only strengthen social protections, but also address the dysfunction at the root of financial and economic systems that have been producing outcomes like extreme inequality, widespread precarious work, and climate change for quite some time. My question is, what specific policies or economic incentives might support a shift from the current financial and economic systems toward the more localized, circular, and shared ownership models we've been hearing about, so that we're not creating more precarious work in a localized economy?
Thank you for your question, Sue. Let me go to the distinguished representative of Burundi now. We are giving it some time for the connection to take place. Just bear with us, please. Looks like we're having difficulties, so let me go to Pierrette Cazeux. Pierrette?
Good morning, Excellency and Delegate. My name is Pierrette J. Cazaux Sabia. I am the president of the Haiti Kalwa Research Funding Foundation. Many thanks for inviting me to be a speaker at the floor. The question is, how can internet broadcast company and advocacy groups for low-income families come together and create gateways, allowing an equitable broadband access for all low-income families. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the surface the ugly face of the digital divide in America. Low-income families, and particularly Hispanic, have borne the agony of being denied broadband access due to cost and living and dwelling not wise for access. This has clearly resulted in witness their children being further left behind in terms of education advance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me now go to the distinguished representative of Cuba, to be followed by the distinguished representative of Japan, and that will conclude the comments and questions, and from that we'll go back to the panel. So the distinguished representative of Cuba now, please.
Support, of course, to the team of Interprofy and the Social Development Commission. We have been experiencing some technical problems today. Como expresa el informe del...
As is stated in the Secretary General's report on the priority issues and emerging issues, COVID-19 has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities. The pandemic and its effects will continue to widen the gap between countries and within them. Those most affected will be the most vulnerable among us. The current international order increases those differences and inequalities, and rather than solving them, many developing countries, and in particular small island developing states and LDCs, are deciding whether to pay debts or meet the consequences of COVID-19. They have to make that choice, and that has harmful consequences for their people. Developing countries need to build back better their economies and have resilient, inclusive, sustainable social policy. And in order to be able to do that, international cooperation must be prioritized, along with solidarity and multilateralism. Developed countries must honor their commitments in terms of ODA. We cannot have fair social policy and social development for all without ceasing to apply unilateral coercive measures which affect many people. Despite the negative impact of the commercial, economic and financial blockade which has been in place and was in place in Cuba for 60 years and was imposed by the United States, we are facing COVID-19 with much more success than many other countries, and we're helping others to do the same. Now, in terms of our response to the virus, we've focused on older persons. We're also seeking to update our economic and social development models, and we're prioritizing older people here, just as we are when we look at housing, employment, transport, communication, and healthcare policies, among others. We've heard from many briefers today talk about the virtue of what we're doing. We will continue to strengthen our social policies designed to foster social development for all. We will not throw in the towel when it comes to our ambition to build an increasingly fair and just society. Thank you.
Representative of Cuba, and let me conclude this round of questions and comments with the distinguished representative of Japan.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Very much. Finally, I would like to thank all the panelists for the very interesting presentations. And also I'd like to thank the Secretariat for the technical support. Listening to the presentations, I have re-acknowledged that there are so many policies, from risk management to digitalization, that can be taken to empower individuals and build back better. But given limitation in resources and time, I think policies need to be prioritized. And here comes my question to panelists. When prioritizing all the policies, from what perspective should the government do this? Should the government prioritize the policies? Thank you.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of Japan. I will go to the panel next in the order in which colleagues have made their presentation. So I'll start with Jordi, but first we have a final question or comment from the distinguished representative of Senegal. Apologies, the connection is very slow today, but hopefully it will work out soon. Let me go to Jordi to address the questions and comments, and if we are able to have the distinguished representative for Senegal, we will give the floor to the distinguished representative then. Jordi, if you're ready, over to you.
Yes, and can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Apologies for this problem of connection. I guess I should be very, very brief. So if I had to single out two issues or two areas where action is urgent, I would, I guess, signal two of them, which are on the one hand, the importance for young people of training, of skilling, of making sure that not only that they are able to take up the jobs which are changing, but also to create new jobs. I mean, let me put it differently in a very single and succinct form. They should possibly manage to move from job seekers to job shapers. And this, of course, means good education and vet policies. That would be one. The other one, which in my view is fundamental as well, is, and I think that it was referred to before, is social protection. I mean, social protection, at least as we know it in Europe, but of course it's not the only place, but has been based mainly on very linear and very traditional professional paths. And this is changing everywhere. But at the same time, we know how important it is to have correct safety nets. I mean, someone was referring, I think it was you, Pedro, referring before to the importance of social policy. And I remember that some years ago, one of our commissioners referred to social policy as a productive factor. So it's not just a matter of protection, it's that indeed it pays back to society. And my last point, because I was very much impressed by that, both by what the UN youth delegate said a couple of days ago, but also by what David was saying, is addressing the digital divide. It's obvious that IT is more and more important. We are seeing it today, for instance, and it is fundamental that there is a more equal access to IT services across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordi, especially for being brief, and I would appeal to all colleagues to be as brief, if not briefer than Jordi was, because we will need some time also to hear from Victoria, and hopefully we'll be able to hear from the distinguished representative of Senegal as well. I know it's getting very late in Tokyo, so let me go to Megumi Mutu for a response.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. As I'm from a practitioner institution, I will pick up practice-related questions. On the issue of digitalization in the healthcare delivery, as a typical bilateral institution, let me just share what we are doing right now. In terms of supporting the government side, like hospitals, health systems, we are starting out with digitalization of hospital to hospital peer learning experiences. That is one entry point. And then with regard to reaching out to beneficiaries, there are some PPP or blended finance schemes in which private companies who can provide the equipment join. And we have been participating in some of these schemes. So both in the public front and the private front, things are going on. And at the end, we hope that these fronts will be merged together to build a system within a country. That is one. The other question that I take is with regard to the localized shared economy, how we can shift there. I cannot tell a grand design, but at least from some practices, I can tell that this is the time to really look into the natural assets. For example, in JICA, we are working on some projects to combine forestry conservation with the livelihood as well as the, I would say, sustainability education. So these fronts using the natural assets is one starting point in promoting localized, shared, and recycled economy. And then lastly, on the prioritization question, what can we do with limited resources? If I were a head of a department in an aid agency, I would say, okay, pick up the projects that change the system, not just little successes here and there, but change the system. That will be my point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me underline the importance you gave to natural assets.
Yes.
It's something we emphasize also in the Human Development Report. So I'll go back to Cristina Duarte, Jeremy Miller, then David Smith in a second, and I would ask you to think about very short interventions of a couple of minutes at most. But before that, Cristina, if I may, we have Victoria ready. So let me first go to Victoria Tolosa Paz for her intervention of no more than 7 minutes, please. Victoria.
¿Me escuchan? Hola.
Sí,
Buenos
muy
días
bien.
a todas y a todos. Pido.
Good morning to you all. I do apologize for my delay in giving this briefing. Argentina has been in it. We in Argentina have been in a meeting with the president focusing on a program to tackle hunger in the Argentine Republic. Now, I'd like to talk about the pandemic under our president and what, in that context, we understood by shouldering state responsibility to tackle hunger. Indeed, to tackle hunger, we enacted a series of very important public policy to focus on those most vulnerable to hunger. Those most vulnerable in our society were most gravely affected by the pandemic, and we are a government that enacted a policy between to run from 2019 rather to 2020, but we had a new government entering into force in that time, so it was difficult to enact policies then. We had to ensure that a lot of government income went to the most vulnerable among us. We have a universal income, or a universal income policy at least, which seeks to raise the revenue of those in the informal economy. We have the a cash transfer to those most vulnerable in the informal economy, and that was raised during the pandemic. We have food stamps given to those most vulnerable among us, and that looks to supplement income to ensure that food can reach those between 0 and 6 years old. And these are particularly given to children whose parents work in the informal economy. And so ultimately, what we were aiming to do was ensure that our children were properly fed. Throughout this year, we've looked to continue with these cash transfer payments and alleviate the debt burden that the most vulnerable among our society were shouldering. We've looked to alleviate debt repayment burdens, and we've looked to cover their electricity, water, and gas bills. We looked throughout 2020 to, as I said, return to this cash transfer policies, and that can look to have an impact on food consumption. And we've looked to improve food sovereignty so that we can increase the nutritional status of our population. But of course, all that was rendered more complicated by the pandemic. The government has focused, as I said, on protecting the most vulnerable among us, while we are restoring our economic value chains that were damaged by the pandemic. We are looking to protect the income of the most vulnerable, and that can be done with these food stamps and food cards. And at the same time, we need to work to foster this universal basic benefit package, and that looks, as I said, to cover the most basic needs of the most vulnerable, such as their internet bill, so they've got digital access, food access, etc., etc. Education's vital, and the package that we've got to guarantee digital access is fostering access to education. So we're looking to cover internet costs. So on the one hand, we're looking to protect income and reduce the number of things that income needs to cover so that there can be ultimately more dignity for the most vulnerable among us. And all of this has shaped our design of public policy. Public policy is vital because Argentina is committed to sustainable development. And we're also looking to ensure, as part of that, that we increase the living standards of all Argentine people. We began the pandemic with very high levels of poverty, and those have only increased. So we're adopting a holistic approach to well-being. As I said, our work includes the food card and the national plan to look to decrease child morbidity and mortality. And we're looking to decrease inequalities, income inequalities, and we're particularly those that affect children, and we're looking to ensure that they can live a nourished, full childhood. Once and for all, we're looking to eradicate latrines, for example, and increase proper access to proper sanitation for our children. Often children don't have proper access to sanitation. Of course, all of this goes hand in hand with increasing income and increasing access to basic services, drinking water, local sanitation points, etc., etc. There are great fiscal efforts underway to facilitate all of these programs, but that's not enough, so we continue to work. We have 44,000 hectares across national territory where inequality is most acutely felt. And we have a wasting and stunting problem, and that is a result of income inequality and a lack of access to basic infrastructure, and all of this undermines the development that we all wish to see for each and every one of us. So for us, to ensure that we fully achieve all of these sustainable development goals is crucial, and we're looking in that connection to strengthen social policy in the time of a pandemic, but not only. We're looking to strengthen social policy across the board at all times. Our country has entered into serious commitments here and did so in 2015. Now is the time more than ever before to focus on improving that social policy, and we particularly need to focus on those most affected by the pandemic, those working in the informal sector, single-parent household, women that are heads of households, and other vulnerable sectors. Focusing on those sectors is where there is the most potential to remedy hunger. And to do that, we're looking, as I said, to protect basic income, protect access to basic services, and all of this will ensure the full development of children, particularly in all of our most vulnerable population strata. We are working with the World Bank and all other multilateral institutions. Cooperation is important, and it has always helped Argentina to work within the parameters it's established to elevate human development indices and improve the socio-economic and environmental indicators where Argentina is concerned. So thank you very much for that.
We are happy that we managed to get your contribution, because you've highlighted the discussion thus far emphasized quite a lot issues related to income and jobs, but there is a spotlight on the overlapping deprivations that you highlighted. It's access to services, it's access to food, and that's why in our own work we emphasize this concept of multidimensional poverty. There are aspects of poverty that have to do with deprivations that are actually overlapping, and sometimes are not even directly related to income. So thank you for that. Let me, as promised, go now to Cristina Duarte with an apology for having interrupted the flow with Victoria. Cristina?
Posso?
Se faz favor, obrigado.
Obrigada, Pedro. Eu vou ser breve, prometo. Sorry, I was about to speak Portuguese. I'm going to address one question: forward-looking human capital policies. It was a very specific question, and allow me, in a very quick and concise way, to give the example with the education sector. In the past 20 years, I can say that the education policy equation usually had 4 components: schools, desks, books, and teachers. And if you manage to put this together, you manage to deliver education. Today, no. Your equation needs to be a little bit longer. You need to factor in, for example, connectivity. Connectivity is no longer something that is outside your education policy equation. It should be considered also a component of this equation. Second, access to information and knowledge. Up to now, we, in our mindsets, access to information and knowledge was through books and teachers. No longer. There is outside a world of information and knowledge that need to be channeled to the channels of delivery. I was interrupted, Pedro. I don't know if you managed to hear me.
Can you just go back 30 seconds, Cristina? We lost you for a while.
Yes. So did you hear the connectivity as a component that should be factoring in the policy education equation?
Yes.
The second one is access to information and knowledge. As of today, information and knowledge goes beyond books and teachers, much beyond. So from a policymaker standpoint, you need to factor in your education policy equation different channels of delivery, not only books and teachers. Third, if you want to bring education to remote areas without traditional or conventional electricity, you need to factor in your policy education question off-grid renewable energy. And so when you approach human capital policies on a forward-looking basis, basically, it is my understanding, Pedro, that you need to pay attention to policy coherence and policy integration. And I could give you another example. The ICT giants are arriving in Africa in a very strong way. This is no longer an issue only for the Minister of Telecommunication. As Minister of Education, you need to question yourself, what should I do to leverage this phenomena of these giants arriving in Africa in terms of delivering content? How should I position the education sector when the country is deciding the regulatory framework, when these giants are arriving? And I believe the only way to address the digital divide and avoid that addressing the digital divide, you only address the consumption side of the digital divide, but you factor in the benefits of the user. The only way, I think, is to adopt these forward-looking human capital policies. Thank you, Pedro. Back to you.
Thank you, Christina. Very important points. And I would add that much of what we said in the field of education applies to some extent, at least also to health. Perhaps not with as much intensity, but how the digital economies are changing the way in which we are able to access services, and the preconditions, as you indicated, that are needed to seize on these opportunities are very much central. Okay, so I promised that I would go to Jeremy and David, but before that, I want to try once again to hear from the distinguished representative of Senegal. So let's see if this is possible now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Please go ahead.
Okay. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir donné la.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I would like to make a brief contribution on behalf of my country, Senegal. So, in terms of this topic that we're discussing, the implementation of many programs in Senegal, and since 2012, the Senegalese government has made strong commitments to ensure that our country focuses on shared prosperity through the Emerging Senegal Plan. This seeks to create an emerging Senegal by 2030 with a society that demonstrates solidarity and that follows the rule of law. This commitment is enshrined in our National Social Protection Strategy, which has a life cycle approach. We've also created a general delegation for social protection and for national solidarity to ensure better coordination between work in different areas of social protection. Senegal has also established a single national register to facilitate targeting households that are particularly vulnerable or indeed living in extreme poverty. We've also established a national stipend system for families to fight vulnerability and social exclusion of poorer households. We also have economic stipends for empowerment and resilience for vulnerable households. Senegal has also set up a national universal health care system and a equality of opportunity map, which is a mechanism for social protection for persons with disabilities. We also have a new national gender equality strategy too, and this is from 2016 to 2026. Also, we have a national strategy for child protection too. Since the start of the pandemic, our president has been taking exceptional measures, declaring a national state of emergency, health emergency, in the framework of the fight against COVID-19. So these measures seek to prevent all forms of virus transmission. And it's within this framework that the government has set up an economic and social resilience program, which is an overall value around 4 pillars: strengthening the health system, strengthening our people's resilience, and also macro and economic and financial stability system to support the private sector and to preserve jobs.
Let me thank the distinguished representative of Senegal. And let me go, as promised, to Jeremy and David with an appeal to stick to 1 minute because we're running out of time. And I need to hand over to the Vice Chair. Welcome to the meeting to conclude. So, Jeremy, briefly, over to you.
Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, quickly. One thing, there's so much to talk about, but I'll be very, very brief. One thing which hasn't been discussed too much is the need for decentralization down to lower levels in the governance structures, but that must be combined with openness and transparency, of course. And the other thing we haven't discussed too much is collaboration with the other actors in society. It's not just the government. They have to cooperate with the private sector and very much with the social sector as well, NGOs, but also local communities. There's a lot of assets out there which can be valorized if the right policies are put into place. And this can help bring in new forms of innovation and new assets in terms of buildings and competencies, etc. So I think this idea of collaboration across all actors in society is extremely important, valorizing those assets, using policies to do with, for example, social innovation, which have been very successful in Europe, for example, to make sure that people are involved and empowered. And that just means that power is given to as many people as possible. But within this context, as I say, is openness and transparency. Okay, thank you. That would be my priority, I think.
Well, that was perfect, Jeremy. Thank you. David, over to you. Again, 1 minute, please.
I would say that what we would want to focus on, particularly there were aspects about access to internet. Within urban centers, there's plenty of coverage, but access is an issue. Outside of urban centers, coverage becomes an issue, and maybe government should be working with the development banks and also the private sector to roll out additional infrastructure so that access and coverage no longer becomes an issue. It's very, very important to work with those companies. I think that's absolutely vital. And if we can improve well-being, then that will raise human capital and improve resilience. The last point I want to make is that if we look back at what the COVID outcomes are, even in a small set of islands in the Caribbean, deaths vary by a very large amount. So it's extremely important for governments to share what is working with each other so that we could learn from the experiences of those with very low death rates and help to work those lessons that they've learned and put those in place in other countries as well.
Thank you, David. And let me also thank all the panelists. It's been a privilege. I learned a lot. Also to the colleagues from DESA that were so meticulous in organizing this meeting. And with that, I hand over to our Vice Chair.
It seems we have reached the end of our interesting high-level panel discussion on emerging issues, and I would particularly like to thank Mr. Conceição for skillfully guiding the discussion. I would also like to thank the distinguished panelists as well as the delegation for their participation and valuable contributions. Before adjourning, I would like to remind you that the Commission would hold an interactive dialogue with senior officials of the United Nations system on the priority theme this afternoon at 3 p.m. on this platform. The meeting is adjourned.